I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. We are going to record this for those who can't make it tonight. Given the gravity of this topic, we asked Betty to start us off with the breathing exercises. But it'd be nice for us to take a moment just to center and then maybe some style before I get into the
As Coleman says, he just asked a few minutes ago to do some breath work with us, to settle with the silence. But it really is important because some of this information might cause us to feel really uncomfortable. And rather than running away from the discomfort, just remember to breathe and let it go. So let's start with, we're going to settle this in silence, silent worship. Put your feet on the ground, so we planted on the ground, and sit up straight, kind of get your shoulders back up straight, and just be still for a moment and take a deep breath in all together. A long exhale. 2 more times. Notice if there's any tightness, any place in your body right now that you might want to move around a little bit with the muscles, kind of breathe into that area. But then notice as we go through the evening, through the presentation, if there's any place that becomes tight or uncomfortable. Just feel it, breathe it, don't run away from it. Come back to your breath. Know your breath is always there. Feel it settle in silence, and Coleman will bring us out at the appropriate time. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Betty.
So I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Jim, could you put up the slides? And I'm also going to ask you to let me know if there's anything in the chat that needs addressing. Okay. This is some research. I'm here to report or share some research I've done through my professional responsibilities. My firm, I work at a firm called Brattle, and we were asked to quantify reparations for all transatlantic chattel slavery, which is somewhat of a daunting thought. And I want to say up front that what we're going to talk about is what, to quantify it, we have to talk about what it is we are compensating for. And it gets into some difficult topics, and if anybody needs a break, please take it. If we all need a break, somebody say so, and I think it'd be fine for us to take it and resettle. So, a little bit about, if you could go 2 slides ahead. A little bit about Brattle. These are the folks that at my firm that worked on this. I had 4 folks who put in the hours to get this done, but we were supported by an awful lot of other people. We were not asked to do this work because we were experts in slavery or had really any expertise there. What the Brattle Group is an economic consulting firm. And the bread and butter of what we do is estimate economic damages in litigations and arbitrations. And we were asked to do this work because of our expertise in estimating economic damages. And we're asked to apply it to this topic. We were, go to the next slide, we were invited by Judge Patrick Robinson, who is a judge on the International Court of Justice in the Hague, UN body. They settle disputes between countries. The last notable ruling that they did was they declared that the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is illegal under international law. Judge Robinson is the one who invited us through Natalie Reed. There's a number of people here, but Natalie Reed was our contact. She is the woman who we knew through our commercial work and who knew about our ability to estimate damages and was our liaison with Judge Robinson. The Judge Robinson was the head of ASIL, which is the American Society for International Law. So this is a group of lawyers who are interested in international law. They held a symposium almost 2 years ago on reparations, on the issue of reparations for transatlantic chattel slavery. And the first symposium addressed the issue of whether or not, under the standards of international law, slavery was illegal. Many people argue that because it was legal in the law at the time, that there was no international law claim. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give you the full explanation to what they found, but the essence of it, I think, is that when slavery was outlawed in each country, it was always done because of an argument that it was immoral. And that argument, at the time it was outlawed, recognized that at the time people knew it was wrong. And I believe that's the essence of why, under international law, there's a claim against on chattel slavery. They held a second symposium, which was about a little over a week ago, that was supposed to focus on quantifying what the level of reparations are. And that's where they had asked the Brattle Group to come in and estimate it. And that's the work I reported this, we reported this at the symposium a week ago, and I'm gonna go through the analysis we presented there. There is also available, this is still kind of draft, but we have a rather lengthy report backing up all the stuff that I'm going to talk about. For anybody who wants to know the details. We were asked to be comprehensive in estimating reparations, but we weren't asked to assign them to take on the issue of how they would get paid. We were asked to be clear about, at the country level, both the colonizing and colonized countries, who was responsible for the reparations and who it was owed to at a country level. But in the analysis we've done, we don't take it beyond that. There's a lot of interesting work going on in the US right now in commissions on reparations about how to actually pay them. I think that Judge Robinson's desire here is to have a solid estimate of what the harm was. And that then becomes part of a political discussion about how to remedy the harm that's still here from transatlantic chattel slavery. I don't think he's intending to start issuing invoices to any country. And I don't think he sees it as reparations being, at least in his view, being individual, in that it's about writing checks to people. He sees this much more as a broader scope of how to rectify the harm. And I think the usefulness of this in any discussion about reparations is, to the extent anybody thinks they're expensive, you need to appreciate that the damage done was significant. And that's what we focus on here. So, reparations. I want to emphasize that reparations are about a lot more than dollars. They're about righting wrongs. And the restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction are all important aspects of this. And we were only asked to focus on the compensation portion of it. And that's all we focus on. But I don't want to leave the impression that because I'm going to be talking about dollars and cents, that we don't appreciate that there's a much bigger effort behind what a full set of reparations would do. And even within the area of compensation, I have to just say that even that can't really be done. You can't write a check. You can't really compensate people for the harm that was done here. That doesn't stop us from putting numbers on aspects of harm, but we don't do the full set. We don't pretend that we're estimating the full set of harms. There are some harms that we just haven't even endeavored to estimate. And I'll talk about some of those. And the ones that we do are in some cases incomplete. And then I also just want to briefly say about these other estimates. There have been estimates of reparations, but they've been narrower. Very interesting. If you Google Empire Pays Back, there's a nice YouTube video of these economists and accountants who estimated $7.5 trillion owed by the United Kingdom for their part of slavery. There have been a number of estimates in the US. The last one, Darity and Mullen, has been getting a fair bit of attention lately. That's an estimate that's based on wealth disparities, and I just point that out now to say that we're going to come back to that. That's going to be one aspect of ours. But to put in, just keep in mind that others have estimated this partially, and they have numbers that are in the trillions of dollars. And what I think is unique about what we were asked to do is it's the first time somebody was asked to estimate it across all countries for all transatlantic chattel slavery. So an overview of how we're going to go about this. The first thing we do is we divide our analysis into two time periods. We estimate harms that occurred during the period of enslavement, and then we estimate harms post-enslavement, some of the harms post-enslavement. In each of these periods, and I'll be clear about what we do, in each of these periods, we estimate some things, we don't estimate others. We just we weren't able to estimate all of the different categories that we think potentially could be estimated. And I'm going to say a bit about interest rates up front. We'll see this throughout the analysis, how important this is. These are harms that have taken place over the last 500 years. And when you are talking about vast time frames, there's a great sensitivity to interest rates. And in some sense, the whole, not the whole analysis, but much of the analysis really turns on what interest rate you choose to translate $1 of harm that was done in 1800 to what you think that the equivalent dollar is today. We have used 2.5% as the interest rate to translate harms in the past to the present. Over the last few hundred years, inflation or the purchasing power of money has been about 1.5%. So the 1.5% of the interest rate is really just to keep $1 the same, with the same purchasing power. We add into that about a 1% real interest rate, or the value, what you actually have to be paid for the delay in receiving $1 or delay in receiving it. That 1% is low. It could easily be justified to be higher. You'll see what happens to some of these numbers when it is, but to be conservative and to also try to not make this analysis be about the interest rate, we take a very low interest rate and let the rest of the numbers sort of speak for themselves. And there's other things that could have increased interest rate that we didn't address as well. But 2.5% is where we end up. All right, so now we'll jump into during the period of enslavement. So on the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to estimate 5 different categories of harm for an individual that was perpetrated against individuals while they were enslaved. The first one is the loss of life. So either the loss of your life from the Middle Passage or the shortened lifespan that you had living as an enslaved person in the Americas. The second category is unpaid wages, the fact that the labor you gave was not compensated. The third one has to do with loss of liberty. You were not free to leave. So separate from compensating you for your wages, there was also a harm in that those wages were not freely given. There was personal injury. We attempt to put a number on that there was bodily harm to people that was different than a free laborer, for example, would have experienced. And gender-based violence, which is a category which includes rape and forced pregnancy. And to be honest, we call it gender-based violence because we just couldn't keep writing rape and forced pregnancy throughout a paper. It just got too upsetting. There are a lot of other harms at the time that we don't estimate. One would be psychological mistreatment. In the comments of the symposium last week, we got some suggestions on how we might be able to add that category to our analysis, and we likely will when we revise the paper. But there's a lot of other things that we don't even attempt to harms that we don't even attempt to quantify. So family separation, the fact that families couldn't stay together, that you didn't have names, you didn't have heritages, being disenfranchised politically, socially, and in the paper we talk about some others. This is simply to acknowledge that these are additional harms that are legitimately should be compensated for, but we have not figured out or not yet added numbers to them. So, little background information on getting these estimates together. So the first thing is we had to figure out how many people were enslaved. And we did this by country, colonized country. We also, as you'll see throughout the presentation, can tie each colonized country back to the colonizer country, which is how we apportion the reparations by who owes what. We know we have reasonably good records of people who embarked on the Middle Passage and who disembarked, by implication, those that died on the way. And we have estimates of those that were born in slavery. In the US, we have pretty good records of that. In the rest of the Americas, we don't. And so the estimates for those born in slavery, the rest of, in the rest of the Americas is much rougher to say. It's also a very different number. We know that for every enslaved person who disembarked in the United States, there was 22 people born into slavery. In the rest of the Americas, collectively, there was about one person born into slavery for every 3 people that disembarked. So very different experience, very different numbers.
Do you know why that is?
Partly it's because in the United States, relatively, not early, but relatively early on for us, we outlawed the importation of slaves. So I think in 1809 or 7 in the Constitution. So from that point on, although there were still people coming legally, at that point on, the economic model was based on the population replicating itself. In the Caribbean in particular, the model was that it was cheaper to import somebody new than to establish people to replicate themselves. That changed toward the end of that period, but only at the very end. In total, divided through the areas, and over time, we have the numbers by decade, going back to our first, I think 1510 is the first decade that we look at. There's about 20 million people who suffered from enslavement in the Americas. As I noted, we apportion this by the colonizing country. So this is just a representation of those. This is just the not the born in the country, just the embarkments in the Middle Passage, but by colonizing country. And as one of my colleagues said when it came to this paper, he said, "It sucks to be Portugal." As they were responsible for the most. I want to now make this is a methodological point, so that you understand the numbers that are coming. The first 2 categories that I mentioned that we talk about are loss of life and unpaid wages. In estimating an economic value of a life, I want to start by just acknowledging that that's many people find that an immoral question to put a dollar value on a life. And lots of Thanksgiving dinners spent with my mother and I going back and forth on this issue. But for the purposes of this exercise, we have to put a dollar value on it. There are a couple of different approaches that economists have taken to valuing a life. One of them, and the one that we adopt here, has to do with the money you would have earned had you lived and worked. So it's in essence the hours, the days, the years of lost life compensated at the going wage rate. Uncompensated labor is also compensated at the going wage rate for free labor. And because we don't have good information on the life expectancy of an enslaved person in the Americas, we found it very difficult to break this calculation into 2 parts, but realized that we could do it in one calculation by adding lost wages and loss of life together. And that's because our counterfactual world is what life expectancy would a free person have had? So whether you lost your entire life or it was shortened, what we are measuring is the value beyond your life as an enslaved person to the life expectancy of a free person in the country in the decade that we were estimating it. And so if you can see that if you put the two components together, by just measuring what the wage, a free person's wage of a free person's life expectancy was, you're going to capture unpaid wages for while the enslaved person was alive and the compensation for loss of life for when they worked. Whether that is a person in the Americas who has a shortened life, as this is sort of expressing, or whether it's somebody who died on the Middle Passage and it's their entire life. We still assume it's a free person's life expectancy.
Question for you. What was your point of reference for the wage for a free person?
Excellent question. Next slide. So we had some information, not for the entire period, but from the 1760s, 1880s on US, it's from Massachusetts, but it's US wages by occupation. And we use agricultural wage as the basis for it. You will see, this will come up in a minute, when you get into the rest of the Americas, there's a question of whether or not the free wage in, say, Jamaica was higher or lower than it was in the US. Because it's an agricultural wage, there's actually no strong reason to believe it was any different, but we don't actually have enough information to know. I mean, we might with more research, but we just didn't.
So you just apply the agricultural wage or even stonemason work that would have been done?
Yes, yes. And we assumed it was the same elsewhere. We do some sensitivity on that assumption as well. And we have to get earlier than 1760, we have to do some statistical projections back in time. We assume the workday was a 12-hour day. Some folks have made the argument that since you were enslaved 24 hours a day, you should be paid 24 hours a day. I have some sympathy for that, but we didn't do that in this paper, simply to say, if you take that point of view, just double all of the numbers. There are some people who have estimated reparations who make an offset for food and housing given to the enslaved person and look at the wages minus that. We don't do that. We assume that if you were captured in Africa and brought to the US, that you were captured at age 20. So the calculation for loss of life or unpaid labor starts at age 20. But if you were born in the Americas, we assume that your work life started when you were 5 years old. And as I mentioned earlier, that you would have lived to the age of a free person in the country in the decade of the analysis. So what happens when we bring this all together? We end up with an estimate of almost $55 trillion in unpaid wages and loss of life for the 20 million people who were enslaved in the Americas. You break it out by country. I'll show I'll show that in a minute, but first I want to show the sensitivity on the next slide. I mentioned the importance of the interest rate. So what this is doing, the three columns are to go to the wage rate issue, is if wages outside the US were 75%, 100%, or 125% of the US wages, but our main estimate is at 100%. We show what this number, the 55, the one in the box, the almost $55 trillion number, what it would be at alternative interest rates. So at zero interest rate, that is, if you just took the dollars at the time they were owed, is about $190 billion. And then you can see the sensitivity of the estimates with the interest rate. Ours is at 2.5%. There are scholars out there who think that a 3% interest and have used a 3% interest rate. Had we done that, our 55 trillion number would have been $217 trillion. If we had used a 5% rate, probably a little aggressive, but within the realm of what could be justified, you get a number that's in the I think quadrillions is what comes after trillions. And so this illustrates again the point I was trying to say about just how important the interest rate is into these calculations. Our hope was that by using one on the lower end of what was reasonable, that the interest rate wouldn't be the issue in the political discussion. So this is our estimate. That was our estimate for the first two categories: loss of life and unpaid wages. The next one is loss of liberty. So as a separate category, how do you estimate what losing your liberty is worth? The estimate, our main estimate here, is one based on manumissions, which were when an enslaved person would buy their freedom. And it turns out from some other scholars' research that when somebody was buying their own freedom, they were paying about a 20% premium over what their value as an enslaved person would have been had they been sold to another person and kept as a slave. So this idea that of your freedom seemed to be about a 20% premium on the market value. This is really actually a horrible measure, I think, in a lot of ways. It surely undercounts the value of freedom. Darcy and I were talking at dinner about one of the problems with using market prices is when people don't have wealth, they can't express their value. And these are people who were enslaved buying their freedom. They clearly weren't wealthy. So that this premium is probably depressed over what a true value of the freedom was. Nonetheless, we use this in our analysis here. So a 20% premium over the lifetime value of uncompensated labor of the 55 trillion, 20% of that is another $11 billion. And so that's our separate estimate for the separate line, which is loss of liberty. We sort of sense check this a little bit by looking at two other estimates to show that the 11 trillion is kind of in the middle. So, one thing we look at is in the US, in the United States, when you are falsely imprisoned in prison, states have programs for compensating you for that time. They vary by state and the federal government, but we could look at them, take an average. We can take out what you would have earned, because during the time that you're imprisoned, you're also not working and you're being compensated for that as well. So we had to disentangle how much of that payment is for lost work versus loss of liberty. We estimate the value of what you would have earned at minimum wage over the time you were imprisoned, subtract that from what the state compensates you for, and then on average, it's about $39,000 a year is what in the US is paid. This is a US number, so this is probably higher than what states would pay in many other parts of the Americas. But if you apply that number to the 801 million years of enslavement in the Americas, you'll get about $31 trillion. So almost 3 times the number we're using. Similarly, we looked at what the US government paid in reparations for Japanese who were interned during the Second World War. And it was a little under $11,000 a year is what we chose to pay for reparations for that. And again, if you multiply it out by the almost 802 million years of enslavement, that's 8.6 trillion, a little bit under where we are. So this is just ways of saying that the number we used was in a range of reasonableness. The next category is personal injury. We don't have good information on what injuries, the prevalence of what injuries. We don't have really good ways of valuing how to value an injury. So the approach we took, which I think is my least favorite part of the least best part of this analysis. What we did is we looked at the 9/11 Commission that paid compensation to victims of the attacks on 9/11 and looked at what the average compensation was when somebody lost their life versus what the average compensation was when somebody was injured but didn't lose their life. And it turns out the average compensation for being injured was about 11% of the compensation for losing your life. So we use that estimate, 11%, as a separate estimate for personal injury. And that ends up adding another $6 trillion.
And just as for interest sake, with the 9/11 Commission compensation for loss of life, it's all based on age in terms of like, or is that a totally different calculation that they would have done to that?
They used the same approach of what your lost earning potential was. Theirs is a little worse because age is one of them, but also it mattered. Unfortunately, it mattered whether you're a stockbroker or or worked in the cafe in the Twin Towers. So that was in there as well.
So it really isn't about the other parts of loss of life. It really is about earning potential. Generally, that's how it's done in this field.
Yes, there is. So going back to the approaches to valuing economic value of your life, there's sort of two broad approaches. One is what you have earned. The other is look at what people do to avoid the risk of death. So if you have a job like coal mining that's got a higher mortality rate than another job that's in other ways similar, you can look at how much more you have to pay people to take on a risky job and back out what they demand as compensation for essentially losing their life. Turns out that number tends to be a little lower than the one we're using. That one is the one that the transportation department uses when they decide transportation policy. All right, personal injury. Last but not least for the period of enslavement is compensation for gender-based violence. So here we had to do a number of things. First, we had to know how many. We took an assumption that gender-based violence was directed at women who were enslaved. We know that's not accurate. We know that children were involved. We know that men were involved. But we had no information to base an estimate on that we could find. And we appreciated that the majority of the harm was going to come to women. So we focused our estimate on that. So the first question is, how many enslaved of the enslaved were women? And we have evidence that it's about 35% on average over time. That's about it depends on when, but that's around the disembarkments. So folks who came from Africa. The sex ratios in the US, where it was a multi-generational thing, tended to equalize a little bit, but not so outside the US. So we estimate that 35% of enslaved were women. We estimate that of the enslaved women that were adults over the age of 15, we have some research that showed that suggested 58% experienced sexual assault. That's a kind of weird thing. Everybody lived under the threat. And even that research suggests, maybe it's undercounting. The case can be made that reparations should be paid for every woman or every enslaved person for this threat. To be conservative, we applied the 58% to the estimate of the women, our estimate of women who were enslaved. We then looked to international court cases that paid compensation for gender-based violence in different settings. And came to a rough average of about $50,000. We then took another sort of leap of faith in our analysis to suggest that these were for incidents, wars, specific wars or specific instances. We are trying to apply it to lifetimes of harm. So we made the assumption that $50,000 compensation that the judicial system had expressed was for a year's worth of harm, and applied the 50,000 to the years of adult life of our estimate of enslaved women. And that comes to another almost $7 trillion in compensation or in harm. So, putting these all together, we have the foregone earnings, which are both the foregone wages and the loss of life. We have the loss of liberty, personal injury, gender-based violence. You add them all up, and for the period of enslavement, our estimate of harm is almost $79 trillion. We can pause there, and you can just think about what an enormous number that is. And it's an enormous number because it was obviously a devastating harm, but also over an incredibly long period of time. And this number, by the way, does estimate it across all the Americas, not just the United States. On the next slide, we break out, because Judge Robinson was very interested in this point about the enslaving countries' share of it. And you can see that the United States is the largest, responsible for the largest share of the harm, followed by the UK.
However, that doesn't correlate back to the country that showed the largest percentage of people bringing.
That's right, and that's because, so Portugal at 15 trillion is up there. The reason Britain is a little higher, the US is a lot higher, is because of the United States. So Britain is credited with the harms in the United States prior to 1776. And the US had much higher rates of people born here, so that's why that's different than that colorful chart, which was just based on the transmission or the middle passage.
You suggested we could just think about what a big number 78 trillion is, and I'm trying. For context, can you, like, speaking to the United States, it's hard for me to get my mind around all of the Americas. But do you happen to know what the current wealth of the United States is? So what's the number?
So I will put this in context at the end. These very things I will address for the whole thing. But to answer your question, I think our annual income, our GDP, is 20-ish trillion. And I think the wealth of the United States is something like 100. And when I say wealth, let's be clear, this is market measured wealth, land, assets like that, not natural resources and so forth. But the US is something like $100 trillion, and the world is something like $300 trillion. Roger.
Yeah, I have a question. This has to do with enslavement by which location. In other words, there are some empires that had colonies in Africa that might have done some of that enslavement. Does it include that kind of stuff?
It does not. This was the just transatlantic route, so you had to come across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting, there was actually a lot more people enslaved in the Americas than Africans who were brought here, but we're not counting those either. So this is not about Native American enslavement. Not part of this.
And Canada's not involved at all.
I don't think they had any. So they didn't, they were during this time, they weren't, they were Great Britain on the harming side. On the harmed side, I don't think there was much enslavement there.
Which is why people try to escape to Canada.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I love in Handmaid's Tale that the heroes of that story are Quakers and Canadians. All right. So. Any other questions on during the period? So I'm now going to turn to what we did for the post-enslavement period. And then I'll bring it together and try to give you a little context, although I'm not sure how well that works. So for the period,
Why don't you take a minute and just ask the questions before, and check
Sure.
with people online, if they might want to chat the question, because
great,
you just give us a lot of things to think about.
is there anybody online who'd like to, who has a question? Jim is monitoring the chat, but
Somebody's waving. Rosalind is waving.
No, she's knitting. She's knitting.
Can some people hear? Can some people hear okay?
Can I ask how the estimate that 58% experience gender-based violence, where that came from?
I tell you afterwards,
Sure.
I have to look up the footnote in here, but there was a study, it's based on a study, and I'm pretty sure it's US only. And it was sexual assault.
Mike Lucy has
Mike has his hand up.
Just, I was kind of struck about putting numbers on things and there's, kind of the historical awareness and knowledge up in my head. And this presentation is, I applaud you for it. I applaud the Brattle Group, but it's so dispassionate. And I'm feeling it in my core. I'm feeling it in my head. I'm wondering how the Brattle Group took care of themselves while they're doing this research.
Excellent question. I can't wait to tell them that you asked about it, the folks who are involved. It started with the folks who worked on this. So normally when we get engaged in to do a project like this, or any project, including when we do them on a pro bono basis, like we did this one, the person who brings the case in, the partner, will help put together a case team, and there's some logic to that. Here, when we were asked to do this, and the partner who had the connection was Alexi Maniatis. He was one of the contributors, another white guy who went to Wesleyan, about my age. When he came to me and asked me to help him with this, and I enthusiastically said yes, we had to put a case team together. And my first thought was, the last thing in the world that I thought was appropriate was for two older white guys at the firm picking who's going to work on this project. And so we did something that we don't normally, we've never done otherwise, is we opened it up to everybody at the firm, and not just our consulting staff, including people from our marketing and our payroll and HR, like just everybody at the firm was welcomed into being part of this. So as they felt led, we got about 30 or more people. You saw maybe 20 of them ended up as contributing. As a contributor, I think they spent more than a day in a project. Along the way, we when we would talk about this, I would regularly acknowledge it as a difficult topic. But beyond that, we didn't do anything separate other than only make sure that the only people that were working on were people who really wanted to be in this branch with us. But beyond that, I don't think we did anything special to keep people sane, other than, I think, just acknowledging the difficultness of the topic along the way in our discussions.
I'm aware of my reaction, and I'm just not able to imagine the reaction of a descendant of enslaved to hear this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just strikes me that this is very much focused on the individual, right? What the individual person lost. But I mean, I don't want to say the analysis fails, but the loss, the cultural genocide, the loss of community and relationship, language, culture was so incredible. I mean, I just, you're 78 trillion is a huge number. And to think that it doesn't even account for the literal genocide of a culture of those 20 million people who were brought or found themselves enslaved here.
Yes.
I have a question.
Please.
I don't think you're probably not the first group that have begun to tackle this issue of reparation for African Americans in the US. Were you able to, or did you utilize any of the references or work done previously on reparation in the US?
We did look it up, and the analysis I'll go into in our next section on the period of post enslavement is based on a wealth differential analysis. That's an expansion of the type that was done by Darity and Mullen recently. So the approach taken, the more recent approaches taken have been based on disparities in wealth in the US as a way to estimate reparations. I think it's an incomplete analysis. I'll kind of go into part of it's because it only takes, it doesn't do the part we just did about during the period of enslavement. And there's other reasons I think it underestimates the harm, but it's one that is gaining acceptance as a type of analysis. And our number is a little bit lower than the Darity one. It's crazy to say it. So ours is about 11 trillion, theirs is 13. It's only to say only 2 trillion difference, but it's conceptually the same analysis. I think it's slightly different data sources.
Oh, trillions don't mean very much anymore. We use that for arms and war every day of the week. So
I think it's a point worth making that when we need to spend $1 trillion, we can find it. And
exactly.
Yeah, Roger.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. If I read it correctly, the emphasis is on monetary value of wages and what someone could earn and things like that. But following up on what Kathy said, there's such things as not being able to read or write and depriving people of things that are generational, that will have effects in terms of grandchildren, a family structure, all kinds of social harm. And these things are very, very damaging and lasting and be way past slavery or immediately. And these are things that also have economic value, but they're harder to assess.
Agreed.
I know you had, people volunteer. Were there people of color? And did they have, what kind of reaction? Going back and looking at the injustices of their own ancestors.
There were. So I have to start by saying that Brattle's an economic consulting firm. In the world of economics, we have a significant problem that we are mostly white Americans. It is, so let me, that's a way to start by saying there are not, African Americans are not well represented in that firm to start with. Several of the folks who raised their hand and are on that contributor list are African American as well, but they did not take up the hundreds of hours of contribution of the two. Really, it was the two people, junior people on the author's page. So Mary Olson, who's a white woman, and Rohan, and I'll butcher his last name, unfortunately, but he's Indian, from India. You asked what the reaction to this was. They expressed gratitude that we were taking on this task. But I can't say beyond that.
I mean, a lot of it is, you might look at it as dry statistics, but you have to start somewhere.
There's a broader issue in our work where we estimate damages in litigations. This is true. In our commercial work, sometimes we're estimating damages for things that are unsettling. So we worked for BP in part of the lawsuits around the oil spill in estimating what the environmental harm was. In cases like that, our policy is, although, you know, like I said, the teams are put together depending on the relationships of the people at the firm, but the firm has a policy that if there's a case that unsettles you emotionally or that you don't want to work on, you don't have to. I can't say I see a lot of evidence of people not working on cases for this reason. That might have something to do with them being economists and being dispassionate about this stuff is sort of our thing. But we have a policy that in general, that if you don't feel comfortable with the case, you don't need to work on it. Let me quickly get through the next section, which is our estimate for post enslavement, and then I'll get to some of the contextual points about how to make sense of all of this. So I want to acknowledge that, as Roger said, and others, there are huge continuing harms socially, and there is no, we could not get our heads around a way to measure them holistically. So instead, what we do is following the work of others, we measure a wealth disparity, and I'm going to talk about what wealth disparity measures and what it doesn't measure. And then we, in the paper, and I have a summary here, we go through a number of other numerical representations of harm that are not translated into dollar values, but just to show the empirically the ongoing harm that is largely not captured by or not completely captured by our wealth measure. So when slavery ended and the formerly enslaved enter society, they were disadvantaged by not being able to find employment, not being able to, not being paid the same when they had employment. the social, the legal and social isolation, separation. I'm not gonna try to give a full list, but all of the harms of what we now identify as the harms of racism are derivative of enslavement. And like I said, we can't measure all of them, but when you earn less money, there's sort of two effects that happen in the immediate sense. One is with less income, you consume less. Your life is different because you don't have access to the same number of resources. That's a harm that the person at the time experiences. They also will have less wealth to hand off to their next generation. So the next generation is starting with less wealth than say a white family in America that has more wealth to hand off. And therefore, in addition to all the other social harms, you're starting at a lower economic platform. And this repeats and accumulates over time. And the idea is that wealth today is the end result of this cumulative effect of disadvantage over many generations. What I want to emphasize I don't like about this measure is it misses out on those consumption differences along the way. But it does provide a cumulative measure of some of the harms or partial measure of the harms. And it's a partial measure of all the harms summarized in the law. In the US, go to the next slide. In the US, the approach we took in line with other research that people have done on reparations is we looked at the wealth differential between white and Black Americans. In the rest of the Americas, we took a different approach where we looked at the wealth differential of individuals in the colonizing countries and the colonized countries and looked at that wealth differential. That's a little bit more iffy comparison in the sense that, the wealth differential could be for a lot of reasons. I think you could rightly tie them to colonialism, but that enslavement was only one part, maybe the biggest part, but not the entirety of what colonial harm was. There was resource extraction, there was political issues, political disparities. So that wealth difference between, say, Jamaica and the United Kingdom could be based on more than just the effects of slavery. On the other hand, we're using averages within the countries, and colorism is an issue throughout the Americas. And we are not measuring the fact that in Brazil, a darker skinned person might be more disadvantaged than a lighter skinned person, because we're just using the average wealth of the country. So in that sense, we're underestimating it. What we don't know, and what this calculation is sort of assuming, is that in a hypothetical world where there had not been transatlantic chattel slavery, would there be any wealth differential at all? And we just don't know that. There could be one, it could go in either direction. But I think the reason we're comfortable with this estimate is, this approach to estimating harm, is because wealth as an estimate of harm is itself wildly conservative and undercounting the actual harm. So even if the estimate that we use slightly overestimates a wealth differential in one direction or another, we know that it's still a conservative estimate of the nature of measuring wealth as the economic harm. So in the US, the average white person has almost 6 times the wealth of the average Black person, or a difference in per person wealth of over $250,000. And if you take that differential and apply it to the Black population in the US, of 41 million people, you get about $11.5 trillion as the wealth gap for the United States. If you then apply the wealth differentials by country, from country in America to the colonizing country, and then multiply it by the Black population of those countries, you get another $11 trillion in harm. So together, it's over 22 trillion in harm. And again, we can break it out by the enslaving country, and we have it by every country, summarized here by region. I just want to acknowledge, we didn't measure anything other than this wealth differential, but there are lots of ongoing harms that you can see in the numbers. Across the Americas, all the Americas, there's almost a 9-year life expectancy difference between the colonizing and colonized countries. There's a $30,000 income difference on average. In the United States, unemployment is more than twice as high for African Americans than for whites over the last 50 years. Rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes are also significantly different. One of the points of bringing this information in the conversation is to say that even if you wrote checks and erase the wealth differential today, if you do not deal with all of the other harms from systemic racism, that differential will reappear over time. And it's not just about leveling the playing field now, it's also about leveling the process going forward. So, context. So first, I just want to bring the two, on the next slide, I'll bring the two before and after together. We have the 22.7 trillion post-enslavement period, and then we had our 78 trillion various ones from the period of enslavement. Incomplete analysis, not the full picture, comes out to over $100 trillion. And I think at the end of the day, this is what we were asked to present, was a conservative, defendable number like $100 trillion that can be used in a conversation about about the level of harm that needs to be repaired, and about not complaining about resources when it comes to being willing to do that repair. This number we presented by country. In the next slide, we presented by country in both directions. If you want the paper, it's available at the conference website. You can look up kind of interesting numbers here, but anyway, that speaks for itself. We summarize it again on the next slide by region and by enslaved country. Again, the United States, in large part, large wealth differential post-enslavement, large number of folks that were born into slavery here, large share, ends up with the largest part of the tab, about 100 trillion overall. Quick point on sensitivity. I made the point earlier about how sensitive this number is to interest rates, the 101 trillion at 2.5%. This is just to show that at a 3% interest rate, which, as I mentioned, other scholars use, it would be 3 times as large. And it shows these incredibly long periods of harm and applied interest rate that a 0.5% difference can have a 3 times amount of that, and going up to 5% is again, I said you have to go beyond trillions. So people often say these numbers, $100 trillion is crazy, like GDP in the US is only 20 trillion, and we're saying that we're on the hook for $30 trillion. But it's important to remember that GDP is an annual number, an annual income number for the country. And we're talking about harms over hundreds of years. So to try to put it in the context, we looked at just taking the annual income, the GDP over the last 70 years, with the arbitrary number. But if you take the income of over 70 years and the amount of harm that was perpetrated by each country, you can see it's really quite a small share. A little higher in Spain, but I think it's under 5% in the US, given this context. And then lastly, again, if you do it by as a share of wealth, it's larger shares of wealth in many cases, but wealth is the proper, is a more apples to apples comparison to what this accumulated harm over this long period of time is. And that's the analysis we provided.
Was a recommendation offered as to who would be the overseeing party to execute a plan like this? There are a number of countries involved.
So, I know, well, I'll tell you what I know. I know that Judge Robinson is planning on taking, he has a working group on reparations, and he's planning on taking this analysis once we clean it up and revise it, finalize it, taking it to the political arena in making the case for reparations. I think he sees this more as issues of development aid, trade laws, and things like that, rather than compensatory checks being written based on this amount. I think he sees this as a political argument for doing something, not a precise estimate of what to be done.
Question.
Yes.
Coleman, about the question of wealth disparity by race. It's possible that a number of us in this room, of the white people in the room, have more wealth today because we've been the beneficiaries of the legacy of enslavement and the wealth disparities that were established hundreds of years ago. Sorry, it's a guarantee. I agree. But the point is, if you're saying wealth disparity, you're kind of assuming that had there not been a wealth disparity, everyone, including the black people, would have had the wealth that the white people had. But that's not quite accurate, because the white people's wealth has been exaggerated by the legacy of slavery. So there's some place in the middle is where the wealth per person would have been if there had never been slavery. It's just an observation. And I think one of the things we're grappling with, and I grapple with, is that, I mean, I live on a half acre in this neighborhood that is the legacy of enslavement hundreds of years ago in this community. Excuse me?
Nothing.
Please.
No, I just finished the sentence. The legacy of slavery pushed up white wealth.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
So the question you're posing is, in the context of America, had our country not been founded and had as a foundation slavery as an institution, had we not done that, would the wealth today, how would the wealth today be different? And your proposition that the white wealth would have been lower and the black wealth would have been higher, and we would have met in the middle, is premised on the idea that the total wealth would have been the same and distributed differently. Now, it's at a point that we talked endlessly about it when we put this paper together as to whether or not to make that calculation. In the end, we chose not to. But it's a fair point, but I think it does imply that you know what the counterfactual, the but-for world would have been, the hypothetical world would have been. And who knows, if we had had a more equitable economic system for a few hundred years, our wealth could be much higher for everybody than it is today. Or maybe it's lower. I don't have a good sense of where that would end up.
Did you grapple at all with, 'cause I'm putting myself in the shoes of Great Britain, or particularly Great Britain, I guess, because of their relationship with the United States historically where I live. So like George Washington was British until 1776, and suddenly his wealth, his enslaved people wealth, became the United States wealth. But it's the same person, and other countries, other colonizing countries, I have the impression, I'm not a historian, I have the impression that perhaps Portugal extracted much more of the wealth, and a lot more of it ended up back in Portugal at the time. I don't know what happened then, but like there wasn't as much of like Portuguese in their former colonies that remained and so forth. So did you work on that at all? Did you think about that?
So in essence, our non-US wealth differential was the, country wealth difference. And I think what you're saying is sort of in 1776, we would have been applying that analysis to the US, and that somehow changed. I suspect, I've never thought about this, but does the United Kingdom think that we owe them money from when we went independent?
Well, yeah, I mean, it kind of raises that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it kind of gets to that issue, and I don't know whether.
Or at least if someone's gonna give them a bill for $10 trillion, they'd like to pass it to us.
Oh, yeah, that I think not, well,
That's what I mean.
Yeah, no,
That's
I-
what I'm getting at.
I appreciate your point, because we're not gonna charge them for the harm we measure after 1776.
That's right.
But the harm before, we did take some wealth from them, and I hadn't thought about that, that's an interesting twist on this.
Like, we did have that, but then they declared independence, and that's not ours anymore.
The other thing in talking about reparations and that, who pays what, it is worth acknowledging that reparations have been paid for slavery in the Americas, but it's been to the enslavers for their loss of property. When Lincoln emancipated slaves in Washington, D.C., reparations were paid to the former slave owners. In Haiti, we know the French have been extracting a lot of money for a long time. We cover some of that in the paper as well.
This may be beyond the scope of what you've done, but sort of along those lines. I mean, I was just reading about some of the things that New Zealand has done in terms of reparations for the Maori people in New Zealand, and it's pretty comprehensive, and they've been working on it for several decades. And I'm curious, like, are there other examples around the world where where countries have actually paid reparations? And is there any reason to believe that we'll get there?
Two different questions.
Yes, they both might be beyond the scope.
All beyond the scope of what we were asked to do, but all very important. On the Maoris, I think from what I don't understand it, I don't know well, but from what I understand, New Zealand is a bit of a model here in how to approach this issue. So I think we probably all have something to learn from that. Have reparations been paid? Yeah, reparations for the Holocaust have been paid. So there's the real money transferred between countries for real harms under international law. So there is precedent for it. Should we be hopeful? That's not my. I'm always hopeful, but whether we should have a reason to be or not, I'm not sure.
Has acknowledgement of the harm been done in a significant way? I mean, with Native Americans, that the harm done there was, I don't think it ever acknowledged.
Correct. So, slowly, as Judge Robinson noted at the conference, if you really want it, it's online, you can watch it on YouTube. As Betty said, it's a bit dense. He mentions that things are starting to change. So recently, I think it was the Dutch Prime Minister acknowledged that they were responsible for slavery, that they had a moral responsibility for it. Not a willingness to pay anything, but an acknowledgement of the responsibility. There's, we cover it in the paper, the French government has acknowledged that what they did in Haiti was wrong. And they haven't said they're gonna fix it, but they've come pretty close to acknowledging that they have to. And I think there are, I don't know if I know them off the top of my head, but I think there are an increasing number of examples where governments are acknowledging their responsibility. Only a very small first step, but an important one. I suspect.
Coleman, John on Zoom has a question.
Great.
Thank you very much, Coleman, for an interesting report. I wonder to what extent is this, are these findings going to be made public and particularly made available to advocacy groups who are working towards reparations?
So there's a version of a paper that we wrote that's on the ASIL website now. It's a preliminary version. We're going to take feedback from the conference, revise the analysis, and present a final report to them. My guess is it's going to look a lot like this one. It'll be, I think we're going to add in the category of mental anguish during the period of enslavement. I think that's one we can add in. Not sure about post. So it'll have a slightly larger number. And that'll be a final paper that they'll take. At that point, they, for our benefit, are releasing us from this, that they want to take this and make political points, and they politely said we probably didn't want to get dragged into that as a firm, didn't want to get dragged into that. Separate from that, I'm trying to give this paper wherever we can. I'm talking to different groups, Brookings and others. Brattle will self-advertise it. We may, I think this is likely to get turned into a journal article at some point, so we'll get it published in an academic journal. And we will be, I will be sharing it with anybody who will listen. So if you know people who would be interested, please just tell them about it, let me know, connect me to them.
Yeah.
Kathy?
Has it undergone any peer review at this point?
Only the internal Brattle review process, which is different people at the firm. So we do this this is an issue when we do, if this was a litigation or an arbitration, and we were called as experts to present this in a litigation, it would look like this. It'd be a lot more detailed and a lot more footnotes and stuff, but it would look like this. Our internal process is to have other colleagues review it with we call it red teaming, thinking critically about it. We are trained in what we do to present our analysis in an adversarial proceeding. So there is usually somebody on the other side who's just as smart, and in a commercial case, just as well paid, whose job is to make us look bad. So that fear is what keeps is why the quality of our work. I like to say that being cross-examined is a lot like an oral exam in college, with one important difference, which is in college, your professors actually wanted you to pass. Your opposing lawyer doesn't. So that's the world we live in, but it hasn't been peer reviewed outside. But if we got it published, it would get peer reviewed back then.
I have a question.
Yes, Jerry.
Perhaps you covered this, but I probably just didn't hear it. during Reconstruction with forced labor, especially in parts of the South, was any data considered as a part of this reparation?
Our analysis doesn't incorporate that, other than the effect that's seen in wealth differentials today. So we did not, during the Reconstruction period, we did not measure those direct harms. I think there's frankly a lot more work to be done to try to measure some of the specific harms, and that would be a good example of one of them, but it's not in the current analysis. Mike?
Yeah, I was thinking of wondering how much it would cost for Brattle to figure out how much I benefited from white supremacy and come up with a dollar amount there, but that's not my question. I just want to make people aware that one thing that's happening in our nation is the National Council of Churches, of which Philadelphia Yearly Meeting is a sign-on, has asked President Biden to write an executive order establishing a commission on reparations. And this is similar to a bill that's kind of sitting in Congress. I know they have 190 some co-sponsors in the House of Representatives, which I think is a significant number, but you know, there's a lot going on, and we could study things to death. I hate to say baby steps, but all those baby steps can add up.
And the contribution we hope that this makes is that when we have those conversations, we need to remember that the level of harm done was so significant that really anything being asked for doesn't begin to live up to what was done.
Coleman, this may not be part of your charge, but how do you, assuming that it progressed, how do we ever figure out who the recipient is? Every Black person, or do they have to prove that they had a slave relative, or how would we get our arms around who the ultimate recipients are?
So this work is intended at the national level, so it intentionally avoids that question. And I don't have a good answer for that. I can tell you what little I know about how that question has been addressed. Many states, I think Maryland too, have commissions on reparations that are sort of addressing what that might look like. And as I understand, California issued a report last year on their work, and the position they took, not sure I can defend this, but the position they took was that you had to show ancestry in the US as of 1900. And that was their cutoff. It seems awfully arbitrary to me, but. Jane?
Oh, I just wondered if there was a way that you could incorporate the damage to families, because it seems like that the structure of slavery really broke down all the family structures, and you know, those repercussions are still being felt today. And I don't know, you know, but it's something that I feel like you could at least say something about it.
Yeah, so we do say something about it in the paper when we talk about the things that we're not measuring. So there's sections of paper that they didn't really want, but frankly, I insisted we include it because you just can't not acknowledge this stuff, even if you're not going to address it. I wish we could, the family stuff, the destruction of heritage is an important one, and I just haven't figured out how to make an estimate around that yet. But you do acknowledge it in there.
I was wondering if you thought about separating out in the post-enslavement era, there's the wealth disparity, but there's also an incredible health disparity. And it seems like that could be monetized as distinct from the wealth disparity. Do you have a reason for or against, you know, why you didn't incorporate that separately?
So the reason we did is we ran out of time and went with the wealth as our summary measure. For example, life expectancy, there's a difference in life expectancy. We are measuring a number, we put a number on that, we could add that in. The health disparity one as well, I think there are ways to put a number on that as well, although they might to some extent overlap with the life expectancy differential, but I think that could be added. There's got to be others that we can add to the post-enslavement period. The problem is that the wealth number touches incompletely, but touches on almost everything. So when you, unlike in the period, unlike what we did for the period of enslavement, where harm, different harm, add them up. If we start with wealth, post-enslavement, and add things in, we're going to have to be mindful of how much of the things we're measuring overlap with wealth. Not an impossible job, just a much harder one. But that we will do. Roger, and then.
I like the way it was done as far as harm done and trying to assess it and assigning a value to it. There's one side of the coin as far as looking at it is to whom was the harm done, and that's pretty easy from your study and stuff. But who did the harm is a much more difficult thing because there are varying degrees of culpability and varying circles of people who did the harm, and some merely took advantage because of the institutional racism or got advantage, but didn't do any personal harm, and that's a totally separate issue. And that may or may not be involved in how the payback is done or where the money comes from who's doing the thing.
The other, yes, and the other thing to keep in mind with this exercise is it is being driven by this international law claim. And I don't know to what extent that influences how you would answer that question.
Sort of along the lines of what Roger was saying, that if is restitution, if it's not going to be done monetarily to individuals, would reversing institutional racism and disadvantage in all the ways people of color continue to be disadvantaged? Is that a different way or a way of looking at how to correct or figure monetary calculations into restitution?
Well, I think you have to correct those ongoing disadvantages, otherwise money won't fix it, right? Because you'll just, the paths will start to diverge again. But I'm not sure how I would use that to measure the harm. Not sure.
I'm not.
Ask me later. After the chance to think about it. Kathy and then Tom.
So I'm assuming that the practices of failing to pay on the GI Bill when soldiers returned from the war, discrimination in housing, in a mortgage, redlining, all that was taken into account in the post-enslavement.
The cumulative wealth differential takes some of that into account, not all of it, some of it. What's interesting is of that $11 trillion we measure, or if you look at the 13 trillion that Darity and Coleman measure, I think the vast majority of it actually is housing wealth differential. It comes from the lack of opportunity to access the housing market. So like that is the biggest single economic legacy in that number, which again shows its inadequacy in that if it's measuring that well, think of all the other things it's not measuring well.
Nathan's had his hand up.
Nathan.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate this talk, Coleman, and so much appreciate, I'm gonna turn off my video because I might have low bandwidth. Your vulnerability in standing up here and presenting it. After my comment, I'm gonna put Deuteronomy 15 in the chat, because one of the things that I found interesting about the talk is my own feeling of the harm that I knew that BIPOC people would feel just hearing the talk, and maybe some gathered here could account for that also. I know I do, and yet at the same time, many of us have needed a number, you know, and so getting that number, having that number equates with me to what I've heard from people over a long period of time, which is that if reparations ever happened in the United States of America, we can't imagine how big it could be. And so you've given a quantification, and your standing here is a powerful statement. But also friends, Black and Indigenous friends, have shared how it's hard to talk about reparations when the harm continues. The 2 million Black and Brown and Indigenous men and women are in jails in the United States right now, suffering with enslavement, allowed through the 13th and through other things. So those are different forms of harms that I think, merit our consideration. But the third one that I wanted to ask you about, I'm sure that this, knowing you and your work, has woven into this somewhat, is looking at the Black Quaker Project and Dr. Hal Weaver's work in sort of asking us to look at systemic violence and to consider it with a friend's perspective. And I know that in Baltimore Yearly Meeting, a lot of work is happening this way in our faith and in our practice. I'm wondering if we could also have another conversation where we would look at, or maybe you've thought about, how structural conditions in the Americas were accompanied by friends and our ancestors in systems of harm, like some that have been outlined: health, education, law, and maybe considering, that as another action item. Anyway, I want to thank you again for standing and doing this, and I'm going to post the Deuteronomy. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Tom, and then.
I'm struggling a little bit with the idea of compensation for harms which were perpetrated in the past. So I'm thinking, if my great-great-grandfather robbed a bank and shot somebody, there was a very great harm that was done there to an individual, to a family, and there could be a calculation of the wealth that was lost to that person who was deceased and to their family. And then you could apply the interest rate, and you could figure out, do I owe to the descendants of that deceased bank employee the amount that would be developed by that analysis? So that's kind of one thought that I have. And I don't know the answer to that question. But I also think that, in a way, the wealth disparity today captures, the Black-white wealth disparity captures so much of the actual harm without the historical workup that you've done. It would be a smaller number. But I'm also thinking $100 trillion is not going to change hands in our lifetimes. I'm sorry, it's not. So I'm thinking, is there another number we can get our arms around? And then I'm thinking about the fact that reparations, light, are actually underway in some areas. For example, recently I had a conversation with a guy who sells building materials, and he says, the white contractors he knows can't get work because the contracts are all weighted in favor of Black, Indigenous people of color, which I'm fine with. And there are USDA loans that I can't get that Black, Indigenous, people of color can get, and I'm fine with that. But that's like reparations, light, it's been going on for decades. Well, Department of Agriculture just very recently, but in terms of contracting, now the Supreme Court is not our friend in terms of these kinds of efforts, for example, racial considerations in admission to higher education. In fact, the Supreme Court is a big problem in terms of our doing things to put a finger on the scale to rectify historic injustices.
Great. On your first point about the personal, this exercise, I think my easy out on that is that this exercise being done for purposes of international law are state to state, and therefore are greater than and survive the individual. The harm was state level action that created the harm, and therefore the responsibility remains. I think is the right answer. Betty, and then we come one back there.
Well, I know you mentioned, Coleman, that Brattle isn't, this isn't about implementation at all, this is about getting the facts and doing the research. When you get through this process, is there a possibility that Brattle would make the connections with the groups that are already working on, or making the implementations, or get involved in somehow, or is that totally off the table?
So I don't see Brattle as an institution doing that. I see us gladly sort of promoting the work we've done. I see myself and probably others at Brattle who have worked on this being interested in doing that. But I don't see Brattle as an institution involved like in a continuing basis about how to implement it, although I will raise that as something we might want to consider. Please.
I think I understand a lot of the numbers you have measuring wealth disparity as the sum of impacts on individuals across demographics. And I've come to understand in the discussion about health insurance that, for example, it costs the healthcare industry more when someone is not insured and goes to the emergency department. And I'm curious if there was a point where you wondered or considered whether there were hidden losses of wealth to GDP from a larger number of people being kept in poverty as a result of chattel slavery, or not, whether that became too complex to figure.
So certainly too complex for us to address here, but the point's well taken that that not having the same act, we do talk about differences like in access to healthcare in the paper a little bit as some of these ongoing harms. Those have disproportionate costs. There's also an aspect of this, which is, and economists are really bad at this point, which is we sum up all these dollars and as if a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. But of course, a dollar to you and a dollar to me might mean something different. And a dollar to somebody who doesn't, have health insurance might be worth a lot more, might have a much greater benefit on their lives than giving me another dollar. And that's something economists have trouble with. Hope to work on nudging that, but that's not incorporated here either.
I think maybe a finer point on the question is like, if we're trying to convince people of the value of righting a wrong, sometimes it's helpful to say, well, hey, here's what it costs white supremacists to have racism in the country. Economically, here's how it's costing you.
Yes. So an example of that, I'll give you a quick story and my take on it. So I'm on the Maryland ACLU board, and in the decriminalization, de-incarceration argument, there are times when people on the left and the right get together on wanting to reduce prison population because it saves money. Right, and I've been at meetings where, coalitions were like, look, we're gonna save money, we can get all these Republicans in the state legislature to support it. Stuff like, I'm like, yes, but don't lose sight of the fact that even if it costs money, we would still be for it. And that it's not, that we're not for it because it saves money. So your point's well taken, that as an advocacy point, getting people insured is actually cheaper. getting people housed is actually cheaper than, you know, what we do now. But even if it was more expensive, I'd still.
That makes.
So much of the discussion sounds like how do we, with the reparations, how do we bring people into the white way of life, the white way of thinking, how we quantify everything, how we're so transactional, our whole economic system, which comes from Europe, transported here. You know, I think a real reparation would be how willing are we to dissolve our culture and rebuild it with those that we brought here.
Yes, and I think the New Zealand example is probably worth looking at because I think they appreciate that. I don't know that they fully embrace it, but they appreciate it.
So as a follow-on to this, where we're talking damages. If you were to complement that with what would it have cost the landowners? And how would that have impacted their bottom line? Had they had to pay for the wages to have the crops and the buildings, the Capitol building, the White House, all of that, had they had to pay for it, what would it have cost?
So this kind of measures, had they had to pay for it and done the same things they did, what the check, what the deal is.
But it's with the twist for it being damages.
Yeah, but what's different is, had you had to pay for labor, you might have used it differently. Like, the fact that the labor was free means you're gonna use it in a very different way than if you were actually paying a living wage for it. Same thing, I think, broader point can be true today, is that there's a lot of this issue of if you pay a living wage, will you have all the same people doing the same things? Probably not, but you'll be paying a living wage and they'll actually have life, you know, from it. An example of that comes to mind, for example, but apparently when we built the railroads out west and we used imported Chinese labor, that we treated them as expendable in the construction process. Had you been paying, had you treated them as a human being, you wouldn't have built the rail, you know, you wouldn't have used the same process and the same number of people. It's been an hour and 45, so I think this is probably a good place to wrap it up. I'm not running out of here, and of course, you guys all know how to get in touch with me. If it doesn't come off in this presentation, I do enjoy talking about my work. And we're glad we'll continue this conversation, anyone, anytime. And because you guys on Zoom too. So thank you.